Welcome to Nature Revisited, the podcast. My name is Stefan Van Noorden, and on this episode, we are honored to be joined by Tony Hiss, the author of Rescuing the Planet, Protecting Half the Land to Heal the Earth. Tony Hiss is the author of some 15 books, including the award-winning book, The Experience of Place. Tony was also a staff writer at The New Yorker for over 30 years and a visiting scholar at New York University. Tony joins me today from his home in New York City to talk about this very important book and the impact it could have. But first, a word from our sponsor, Prairie Restorations from Princeton, Minnesota.
Prairie Restorations is excited to sponsor today's episode of Nature Revisited. Founded in 1977 as one of the first native garden centers in the country, Prairie Restorations has grown and expanded the diversity of our native plants and services. Our mission is to produce and provide the most ecologically appropriate seeds, plants, products, and services to restore and manage native plant communities. Shop our online garden center and receive 10% off your order when you use promo code Nature Revisited. Be the change. Be a native gardener and help restore critical native habitat. Visit prairieresto.com to shop the highest quality native seeds and plants. That's prairieresto.com. Again, that's prairieresto.com. Now back to your show.
Tony, thank you for being here and welcome to Nature Revisited.
Stefan, thank you for having me on the show, and thank you for all you do to bring people closer to nature and nature closer to people.
Let's start with what motivated you to write the book, Rescuing the Planet.
I guess it was the plight of the animals. I became fascinated several years ago with a Canadian wolf named Pluie. Pluie had been captured by biologists in the middle of a blinding rainstorm near Banff National Park. In Canada, pluie is the French word for rain. Just at the time when tracking devices could be small enough not to really bother animals, and at the time when signals that the tracking devices give out could be picked up by satellites so that researchers could sit at their desk and see where an animal was. It was thought that Pluie would probably wander around a bit. They knew that wolves did that, maybe 50, 60 miles. And that seemed to happen over the first few months, and then the signal went dead, and they thought, oh, well, technology needs improvement. Several months later, they got a call from a guy at NASA down in Montana saying, we're tracking your wolf down here. Pluie had somehow managed to get all the way down into the States, and over the next 18 months, traversed a territory at least the size of Yellowstone National Park, going through 2 Canadian provinces and 3 U.S. states. So suddenly it became apparent that wolves traversed enormous distances, and no one had known this because it was all done invisibly, as far as we were concerned, out of sight of human beings. So we have this wonderful new way of entering the animal's world. At the same time, we were beginning to eliminate so many animals. Most famously, a giant tortoise named Lonesome George, who was the last of the Pinta Island tortoises in the Galapagos Islands, died at the age of 101, it was thought. Another loss that made headlines was of the last male northern white rhino. This led to the fact that we've now had to coin a new word, endling, meaning the very last of its kind. And it seemed to me that this was an intolerable situation. It was time to put an end to endlings. So I got to work.
So the subtitle of your book is Protecting Half the Land to Heal the Earth. Why half? Why 50-50? And what is the science behind it?
Field biologists have shown that by and large, most species of plants and animals, in order to maintain a healthy population, need to have access to at least half of their original habitat. Some are more sensitive, some less so. At the same time, conservation biology can now look ahead and predict things. We have managed to protect about 15% of the land of the planet in the last 150 years, since Yellowstone Park was set up in 1872. But the prediction was that if we stayed at that level, sooner or later only about 25% of plants and animals could survive. Whereas if we bump it up to 50%, something like 85 to 90% can survive. Not everything, but close to everything. So this became, in a very general terms, the term half Earth came up in a conversation that I had with E.O. Wilson, the great Harvard biologist and conservationist. And at that time, Wilson was willing just to throw it out as a way of startling people, galvanizing them to action, what in the business world was being called a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. The idea being you need to throw out a goal that's not too hard, could be attained, it'll take a lot of work, but it is within reach. At the same time, not too easy, or people just won't bother doing it. Rescuing the Planet tries to be a kind of all-purpose, one-stop shopping book about climate emergency we haven't thought about, namely the extinctions crisis. During the time we've been thinking more and more deeply about the climate crisis, the warming and poisoning of the planet. Well, it turns out this is equally stupendous and equally important and essential. So the book lays that out, the urgency of it, but also lays out the solution, namely that if we can protect something like half the planet, we and the other species can stay alive and healthy. And it also then turns out to be a very positive and hopeful and optimistic book, because it was my privilege, as I was working on it, to travel all around the continent and to meet incredible people doing incredible things to keep plants and animals alive. Something like 1 million species are at risk of extinction over the next few decades if we don't do anything.
Can you share some of the history or the evolution of this idea of 50-50? Who are some of the other people and organizations that are involved?
It actually has quite a lengthy history, surprisingly enough. The idea that we would need to set aside a much larger piece of or sets of lands than we ever had before. In fact, it goes back to World War I days, when the leading landscape architect of his generation lost his business because of the war and got his staff working on what he called a national plan for the future of the United States, in which he would have protected at least 30% of the U.S. Another early pioneer in this direction was a man named Benton Mackay, best remembered as father of the Appalachian Trail. In the summer of 1900, he just graduated from college, and he and a pal decided to celebrate by bushwhacking their way up one of the Green Mountains in Vermont. There were no trails in those days. Got to the top, shinnied up the tallest tree they could find, and swaying there, he suddenly was overcome by what he later called a planetary feeling, the sense that he was part of a single entity that stretched from the highest peaks of the Appalachians in Maine all the way down to the tallest peaks in Georgia, a distance of over 2,000 miles. And it was that revelation that 20 years later allowed him to write an essay proposing a trail along the peaks, as well as protection around the bottoms. And that so caught people's imagination that within the next 12 years, a 2,000-mile long trail had come into being, almost entirely work of volunteers on weekends, vacation days, said to be the largest piece of infrastructure ever constructed entirely by voluntary labor.
So how does the creation of the AT reveal just how possible and necessary 50-50 is?
Well, it shows that when people see something that they consider important and exciting and worthwhile and necessary, they can effect enormous changes in a surprising amount of time. That's one of the reasons I think the fact that the situation where life itself is being threatened is calling into being so many people inspired to do something and do something quickly. The Appalachian Trail is now the model for long-distance trail systems and larger landscape protection areas all over the world. This is one of the great American inventions.
Let's not forget John McPhee. How is he an example of how one person can actually influence other people to act?
Well, John McPhee's a good story for a writer to tell because he's a writer. Came from New Jersey, was always fascinated by this wilderness at the southern end of the state, the New Jersey pinelands. Hundreds of square miles of wilderness right in between New York and Philadelphia. Land that today is perhaps emptier than it was before the American Revolution. So he began to write about this landscape because it fascinated him. But it assumed, this was back before the environmental movement began to get its push, assumed he was writing their obituary, and that he was mourning something that was about to pass. But it turned out one person, you say, can have an influence. Sometimes luck plays a part in it. Turned out he played tennis with a group of people that included someone who became governor of New Jersey and who was so intrigued by McPhee's writings about the pinelands that he said, I'm going to prove you wrong. They're not going to die. They're going to live. And they are now part of a national preserve. So yes, John McPhee, according to former Governor Brendan Byrne, was the person who had most to do with protecting them.
Let's turn to the Boreal Forest, which is mainly in Canada. Why is it so important?
The Boreal Forest is one of the great assets of North America and of the world. And it is something that is so enormous, even today, that it's hard for a city kid like me to begin to accept the reality of it, even after I've been there. It's 3,700 miles long, stretches from Alaska all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, at least 1,000 miles deep, deep forest, still has all its original inhabitants, has two nicknames. It's called North America's Bird Nursery because not only are there something like 300 species of birds there, but every year something like 3 to 5 billion birds fly up there to make their nests and raise a new generation, and then fly back south in the wintertime. Its other nickname is the Fort Knox of carbon because those trees lock up so much carbon. So it's a very important part of keeping the climate from warming. This forest, so much of it is still unroaded that you can only get from one town to another, in many cases, by little puddle jumping airplanes. And it's something we thought down here in the States at least had disappeared a century ago, the frontier. But that's because we were only measuring the frontier by moving from the East Coast to the West Coast. If we had made a right turn and gone straight north, we would have seen this remarkable landscape still there. And it is probably one of the three largest landscapes left in the planet, the other two being a similar kind of forest in Siberia, in Russia, and the Amazon rainforest. But something like half of the Siberian forest has been tampered with, and we know that about 20% of the Amazon has been cut over. So the boreal is probably the most intact of these large landscapes. And two things about the boreal. One is it helps people here in North America sort of see the continent in their minds, because we're very fortunate in terms of trying to perceive the landscape that here in the States we've got a chain of mountains, the Appalachians, the ones Benton Mackay celebrated, running down the East Coast. We've got paralleled by the Rocky Mountains running up and down the west. Then across the top, joining the two together, is this extraordinary intact forest, or almost intact. And there's also now been a biodiversity hotspot been delineated along the Gulf Coast in the southeast and the Gulf of Mexico. So we've got a nice framework there.
Can you describe and define the biosphere? Something that a lot of us, myself included, are not really familiar with, and why it is so important.
Stefan, the biosphere is something that sounds like just a sort of backdrop to life, whereas in fact it is the entirety of the life that we know about. It's something that we live within, and we're not quite built to sense that withinness. The biosphere is, on the one hand, the totality of all living beings. On the other hand, it is sort of the awareness of life. And we're realizing that it isn't quite adequate just to say we live on the surface of the earth, because the realm in which life forms exist extends below our feet into the ground, and at the same time extends over our head, up into the air. It extends down into the ocean, to the bottoms of the oceans. Side to side, it's endless because it stretches all the way around the world. But top to bottom, it turns out, it's pretty thin. Most life forms exist somewhere in a band between the top of Mount Everest and the bottom of the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean. That's a distance of about 12 and a half miles. Laid out flat, as someone said, it's something you could drive across in 20 minutes. So the biosphere, as the place in which all life takes place, as far as we know so far, it's unique anywhere in the universe. It's something that's quite ancient because it came into being shortly after the Earth was created. It's been the home of an amazing abundance and persistence of species all that time, but it also has this built-in vulnerability. Its third dimension, top to bottom, is quite thin. So that's something we have to start being able to keep in the back of our minds whenever we alter it in any way. There are limits to the things we can do without making trouble.
In the beginning of Rescuing the Planet, you talk about the need for stewardship for the wild places that will be or are set aside, that we need to include all indigenous people into the conversations and preservations of land. The idea that indigenous people are not just the past, they are about the future. Talk about the idea of indigenous guardians.
The Boreal Forest is a good way to start that conversation, Stefan. The Canadians, the English and French Canadian settlers, behaved as badly towards their native inhabitants as we did down here in the States. But one thing they never did do was dispossess them, kick them off the land. So they're still there. And now that this idea of we have to protect more land to keep things going is beginning to come into the fore, the Canadian government is turning to its indigenous people, they're called First Nations, and asking them to set up an entire second national park system, paralleling the first, But in this case, they will be the rangers, the guardians, the moccasins and mucklucks on the ground, as they say, using their knowledge. Some of the parks being talked about are 8 times the size of Yellowstone National Park, so immense pieces of property. And the Australians have done something similar. They've realized the importance to land management of the indigenous people down there, and they've set up a series of national parks operated and controlled and managed by the Aboriginal inhabitants.
So what are IPAs, Indigenous Protected Areas?
That's the name that's now being given by the Canadians to this new system of parks that the indigenous people would administer. IPA, Indigenous Protected Areas, sometimes IPCA, Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas. The Canadians are in the process of setting up not just 1 or 2 of such places, but a system, which would then be a parallel system to the traditional national park system. One of the reasons the traditional national park systems need augmenting is that we've realized that although one of the purposes in setting them aside was to protect the animals and plants they contained, no one ever explained to the animals and plants that there were boundaries, and if they wandered outside and if we'd started to develop the land outside, they couldn't get back in. So they were leaking species. So part of the reason for setting up augmented national park systems is to reconnect the traditional national parks through corridors that animals like Bluey the wolf and others can use. And in this way, we can keep the purpose of the landscape alive with these series of cores and corridors, as they're called, rather than having to protect every single acre within that totality.
So I want to touch base again, because it's really an important part of the book and part of what's going on. And not to underestimate the importance of global warming and climate change, but talk again about why the rapid rate of species extinction is really, in some ways, a more pressing issue.
It's because we need the rest of life in order for our lives to flourish. It is the incredibly complex patterns of coexistence that various species have set up. Plants can get pollinated, giving us a chance to have enough food to eat, that water can be purified so we have enough water to drink, and that there is a constantly renewed supply of oxygen entering the atmosphere so that creatures like us who depend on oxygen can breathe. In fact, so much of that oxygen is generated by other life forms that it's thought every second breath we take, we owe to the rest of life. So it's tremendously important to nourish and protect and cherish the rest of life, not to mention the fact that we're finding more and more that we're in the presence of something far more interesting than we had assumed. René Descartes thought animals were no more than animated pieces of machinery. The bête machine, he called them. Now we know that other species have amazing talents, that elephants are caring and empathetic. We know that spiders can dream. We know that octopuses can recognize human faces. A distinguished German zoologist wrote a book just last summer about bees. A bee has a brain no bigger than a poppy seed, and he showed they also have richer inner lives. So we're beginning to realize we're surrounded by a vast sea of awareness that has several consequences. One of which is there's no such thing as a piece of vacant land, an empty lot. It may not have specific human uses and purposes, but it is full of life. And the challenge to us now is, if we think we need to add some human uses, Can we do so in a way that's similar to what indigenous people do without dislodging and displacing the rest of life that's there, the other life forms?
So in the chapter, A Planetary Perspective, you share some of the people and the places where a planetary perspective is taking hold. Can you share with us one or two of those stories?
Yes. It was my privilege to meet up with people and groups who were doing amazing things, responding in one way or another to this need to protect animals and plants. Perhaps the story that I find most intriguing is that of a man named M.C. Davis from the panhandle of Florida, up in northwest Florida. Had become a multimillionaire commodities trader, but had begun modestly making his first stake playing poker. Never gave the nature of the place any thought, until one day he was caught in a traffic jam, sitting there fuming, saw a sign on a local high school billboard, Black Bear Seminar, said anything's better than this, peeled off, went inside a high school auditorium, said there were half a dozen people in the room, a couple of drunks sleeping it off, Canadian tourists who were lost, hoping for some free donuts. Up on the stage, two remarkable women who were talking about the plight of the Florida black bear, the local subspecies of black bears, and how they were disappearing because their habitat was disappearing, namely the amazing longleaf pine forests of the southeast of the United States. Stately, park-like forests begun to disappear right after the Civil War. Once the plantation system collapsed, they turned to the trees for wealth. So he was struck, smitten, amazed, had no idea. The next day he sent the two ladies enough money for them to keep their group going for 2 years. No one had ever given them that kind of money before. They said, "What is it you're looking for? What do you want from us?" He said, "I need you to give me a list of the 100 most important environmental books. I'm playing catch-up." He spent the next year reading the books, then started buying up played-out peanut farms in the neighborhood, put together a holding of 51,000 acres on which he said he's going to replant longleaf pine, which he then began to do, spending something like $500,000 a year. Well, I caught up with him about 13 years into the project. I thought the place still looked rather scruffy, and he said, "Well, yeah, come back in 287 years. This is a 300-year project."
Is there another?
I had a chance to talk to a man named Tony Clevenger. About 20 years ago, he had the idea that there was something you could do to make highways less dangerous, something like 1 million collisions a year between cars and trucks and large animals. He decided that you could rethread natural corridors over and under big highways. Banff National Park, the premier national park in Canada, is crossed by the major east-west highway. This makes it almost impossible for animals to cross safely because something like 30,000 cars a day in the summer pass along these roads. Clevenger said, if we can give animals a crossing under or over, maybe we can induce them to use these crossings, and maybe that will cut down on collisions. Collisions are down something like 80% because of all the underpasses and overpasses. He started up there, documenting it carefully. Something like 200,000 animals of all kinds have crossed over. And it turns out that reunites animals into a single population that had been cut in half, that we didn't realize it when we built them, but the interstates act like gigantic fences. Well, this is an idea that's now catching on all over the place. There's even money in the new transportation bill for road crossings for animals only. And this is a way of retrofitting the unintended consequence of the interstate highway system of the 1960s and 70s.
In your book, you talk about the Delmarva Peninsula that runs along the Chesapeake Bay. and how it could be the forerunner of a national system of green line reserves.
Yes, Delmarva is an awkward name, but it's an awkward name for an awkward political reality. 3 states occupy this single peninsula. Most of Delaware, parts of Maryland, parts of Virginia, Delmarva. It's the largest piece of open space still existing along the east coast of the U.S., something like 1.6 million acres altogether. Half of it is still natural. 30% of it is already protected. It gets incredible populations of shorebirds in the wintertime, tens of thousands of snow geese. It has changed so slowly that you can go to the site of a battlefield from the War of 1812 and stand exactly where the Americans stood and where the British troops marched up through the woods, and nothing has changed. And in the 1960s, they managed to start thinking of themselves as a place worth protecting. Shell Oil was going to build an enormous refinery along the Delaware at the top, and an adroit citizen began purchasing up some of the land that they would need, little bits here and there, and began a citizens campaign called To Hell with Shell. Now there is a group coming together made up from citizens and biologists from all 3 states and state land officials and federal land officials to make sure that even though it's split 3 ways politically, it can think together as a place. And that's the kind of thing that could be duplicated across the country, namely the so-called Blue Line Park. The most famous example of that is the Adirondack Park in northern New York State, 6 million acres. It's not all public property. Half of it's private, half of it's public. But because it has been acknowledged to be a special place, as the private part changes, it can only change in a way that will keep the totality in mind. This kind of park, it was thought in the 1970s, could be duplicated all across the United States. And the National Park Service was, in fact, about to roll out a second national park system based on Blue Line parks in the early 1980s. However, the Adirondack Park has inspired other parks around the world. In fact, the entire English National Park System is based on this public-private partnership. And since most land in England had been in private hands for thousands of years, they came up with the American Adirondack Blue Park System approach, declaring these lands to be special places that would change in ways that respected their specialness.
What are some of the other encouraging changes you have seen since writing Rescuing the Planet?
Just a couple of weeks ago, I was up in the far west of New York State. These are the 8 counties of New York State that back up onto Lake Erie. So the local land trust in that area, the Western New York Land Conservancy, group that's maybe 30 years old now, has a pretty exemplary record for a smallish group, protected maybe 10,000 acres in 30 years. Suddenly, they've been inspired by the nature of the forest up there and the reality of the fact that so much of it is still intact. And they're now creating something called the Western New York Wildway, which, when complete, will protect 1,100,000 acres of gorgeous New York State forest, and then can be linked to the Adirondacks through corridors. And it also means that yet another amazing landscape can enter the picture, because on the backside of the Appalachians, there's the Allegheny Plateau. So here's a way of doubling the protection, both as habitat and as corridor for plants and animals moving north as things get warmer. But now we have this second approach to the west through the Allegheny Plateau, so it's double protection.
So as we close, what is the next step?
The next step is something that suddenly has become sort of a reality as a result of a meeting in Montreal last December, where 188 countries adopted a pledge to protect far more land and do it very quickly. The shorthand for this is 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the planet by the year 2030. As I said, that is a tall order because we've protected 15% so far, and it took us 150 years to do that. The Biden administration has separately made its own 30 by 30 pledge, and two U.S. states so far have followed suit, California and New York. And various towns have also made it their priority. So next steps are to do what we're already doing much more quickly. And next steps are that it's almost impossible not to find a way to get involved if that's something that interests you or intrigues you. If you live in a suburban area, there's this wonderful approach that Douglas Tallamy has put forward, homegrown national parks, where you can take at least a slice of your lawn, convert it to native plants that bees and butterflies and other pollinators can use. If you live in a city and you don't see any greenery around, one thing you can do is work to get city officials to turn those street lights down. Much younger Canadian equivalent of Benton Mackay named Harvey Locke came up with the idea when he was camping out that he was in a single area that stretched from Yellowstone Park north to the end of the Yukon. Y to Y, it's called, Yellowstone to Yukon. And of course, it's conceptually already been extended southwards as well into the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico. So all kinds of things going on all over the place. And it's just a matter of accelerating. We're in a very interesting situation, Stefan, where we're sort of just beginning to take a hold of a new way of looking at things. We've had odd opinions about nature for a long time. So much of our life is now devoted to human purposes that nature sometimes seems like just a backdrop to daily life, or a reward we give ourselves maybe on weekends, or we have this leftover idea that nature was something that needed to be conquered or tamed or transformed rather than something just to live in the midst of. It's just beginning to dawn on us. We are immersed in it all of our lives.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Tony Hiss, and that you get a chance to read this important book, Rescuing the Planet. Nature Revisited would also like to thank Prairie Restorations for sponsoring this episode, and that you will share the podcast with friends, family, and colleagues. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and our website, nordenproductions.com. The music for Nature Revisited is Buzzin' Fly by Tim Buckley. Nature Revisited is produced by Stefan Van Orden and Charles Gagan, and I hope you will join us for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, remember, we are nature.